All right. We are back on track to make progress. In fact, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Tonight we will begin looking at the fourth of the 7 vision sequences, the one that I have tongue-in-cheek titled 3 Monsters and a Baby. I got one left. That's worth it all right there. Okay. Here's where we are. As I said, we've essentially completed half of the book as far as looking at it. If you include all the introductory material we had, we're well over half done. So tonight we'll begin this 4th sequence, and then of course there are 3 left. Now, this is not on your outline, but this is my proposed schedule. I think when I said that I intend to have it completed before the holidays, some of you didn't believe me. I actually do have a plan. Now, we're probably going to miss one of these Sunday nights for an outing. Some of them may stretch longer by necessity, and that's okay. We may use a couple of Wednesdays. We'll adjust as necessary. But, in general, I just want you to see sort of the way we have it laid out, or I have it laid out. Tonight we'll be looking at chapter 12. Our next section will cover chapters 13 and 14. That will conclude sequence 4. We'll have 2 weeks on sequence 5, the bowls, the plagues, and introduce the prostitute in chapter 17. Actually, that's the beginning of sequence 6, and that'll go for 3 sessions, concluding with the marriage supper. And then 3 sessions on the final sequence. We'll spend a week on chapter 20 and talk about millennium, that word that troubles us so. We'll talk about everything new, and then at the last, we'll wind up with chapter 22 and a summary. And my intent is that last session to actually be short and have a long Q&A. We'll see how that goes. But this is my plan. So just so you know, I'm not just puffing smoke. I do have a plan for us to get through this. And the reason that we can go at this rate is because at this point, we're going over a lot of things. We'll be referencing what we have already learned and applied. And so I think we can do this pretty close to the schedule. As I said, we'll adjust as necessary. All right. Sequence 4 at a glance. The sequence covers 3 chapters, 12, 13, 14. Tonight we'll be discussing the dragon, the woman, and the child. Next week we'll be covering 13 and 14, or next session. That should be next week. Which has 2 mysterious beasts, as well as the lamb. Once again, we'll see that number, 144,000. We'll see 3 angels and a harvest. I'll do my best to pause when I see people writing. Just don't write slow. So that gives you sort of a heads up about where we're going this week and next. Here's some things to watch for in this sequence. Some of it tonight in chapter 12, certainly between this session and the next, we'll see these. There's a counterfeit trinity. This should be of no surprise. Our adversary has, from the beginning, tried to mimic God's movements, God's people, God's organization, God's blessing. So we will see a counterfeit trinity. We will see people getting marked. Some of you have been waiting for that. Some of you have been waiting 20 some odd sessions just to get to the mark of the beast. Well, there's more than one mark, and we'll talk about that. You should see some familiar numbers. We've been talking about numbers since we began this study, and there'll be more in this sequence. Also in this sequence, let's take a look at a certain duality. Here's what I mean by that. If you recall back to the opening vision sequence, the 7 churches, that opened in chapter 1 with the vision of the Son of Man, and we saw him walking around amidst the candlesticks, right? And the book interprets that for us. And so the message we took from that is that the Lord himself is moving amongst who? His churches, His people, right? Now we saw the letters to the 7 churches, and we heard about their situations, their circumstances, their issues, both good and bad. So we had a good view, sort of a snapshot of where things were on the earth, right? We mentioned 7 churches by name. We geographically located them. We talked about political struggles, military struggles. All that was conditions on the earth. Now we move to the second vision sequence, that of the 7 seals. And we start off with a vision of the throne room in heaven. And we start talking about how that judgment's being poured out is God's plan. How that it's unfolding from the conquest or the victory of Christ at the cross and subsequent resurrection. And I said at the time, one is an earthly view, one is a heavenly view, but as we go through these vision sequences, we're talking about the same allotment of time, right? So there's that duality. We take a look at what's going on the earth, and sometimes we're talking about the circumstances sort of horizontally, if you will. And sometimes we're taking a more vertical view from heavenward down. So we see that same duality taking place. In fact, we'll talk about that tonight. In Luke chapter 10, those of you who were here for last session, we looked somewhat in depth at a portion of that. Jesus had sent out the 70. They come back, and they're excited because why? Yeah. Man, amazing things are happening. Even the devils are subject to us. So is that vertical or horizontal? Horizontal. They're saying, Jesus, this is what we're seeing with our eyes. Jesus agrees with them. But He adds something to it. He adds that vertical view. He says, that's nothing. It's being more effective than even you know. I'm paraphrasing greatly here. Right? I see Satan falling like lightning. In other words, you're seeing this down here. This is of cosmic significance. There's that duality. There's the view that's horizontal. There's the view that's sort of vertical, heavenward down. All right. So we're going to see that in tonight's session, especially. All right. Let me read for you the 12th chapter. I will read somewhat briskly. You may follow along. Hopefully my fast reading will not be too fast. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to His throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of His Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. That is the 12th chapter. So, let's identify the characters, right? We have three: a dragon, a woman, and a child. And the biggest quandary that I had in preparing this lesson was, what order do we address them in? But let's do the reverse of what I just said and begin with the child. All right. The three main options, or more common options, that I have seen or heard people say: that the child represents Jesus, that the child represents Christians in general, or that the child represents specifically the martyrs of the faith. These are all understandable why they are. Let's take a look at the clues that are in the text and see what we can come up with. All right. So let's start off with the one that's not helpful, because we haven't identified the dragon yet, although I think probably everybody knows where we're going with that. So the child is the target of the dragon. Specifically, it says that the dragon initially wanted to devour the child at birth, and then continued persecution after the fact. So that would fit with any of those things that we identified. The next thing says that he will rule all nations with a rod of iron. This is a reference, I believe, to Psalm 2, verses 7 through 9. I will read them to you. I will tell of the decree, the Lord said to me. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. This, of course, is one of the many psalms predicting or prophesying the Christ, Jesus. Now, in the opening vision sequence, Revelation chapter 2, we also find this verbiage. The one who conquers, this is verse 26 and 27 of chapter 2. The one who conquers and who keeps my works unto the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father. So there we see a reference that says that overcomers, those who persevere, those who remain faithful, the true regenerate, saved church members, they will rule. But notice that their ruling is not contingent upon their own. They are rewarded with this rule to rule with Christ. So as we're trying to identify this child, we see how we could point to Christians, or certainly to martyrs, because they are rewarded with ruling. But it's not our own rule that we're promised. Rather, we are with Christ. It is Christ himself. It is the lion who is the lamb who is cohabitating, so to speak, the throne with the Father. We are invited because of him. All right, next clue. The Bible says that the dragon was there to devour the child, but what happened? Caught up to heaven. This could easily, or most easily, most clearly point to either specifically the resurrection of Christ, or again, I do see some parallel possible, that it talks about the fact that even faithful Christian martyrs whose bodies were destroyed, yet do they die? Jesus said, those who believe in me, though they die, live on. They're caught up to heaven. He's caught up to heaven and to his throne. So here we see this parallel going on. I'm going to say, before we finish this, I think it'll be perhaps already clear, I think this is primarily speaking of Christ. Although, again, we see many parallels, that shouldn't be a surprise to us. It is the life of Christ that we are granted. That's what everlasting life is. His righteousness and his life are credited to us. The life that we live forever is not our own life, so to speak. we get to experience, we get to join in because we are then in Christ. The way that the faithful Christians and the churches are promised to rule as a reward, it's not as if, it's not some sort of quasi-Mormon doctrine where you get to be God of your own world over there, you know. No. It's being joined with Christ. So I think this is primarily of Him. The next clue is that He's born of the woman, who is the most famous baby born in the Bible. Jesus, born to Mary. It is said again, and I will grant that the picture, starting in the Old Testament and certainly speaking to New Testament churches in the New Testament, that sinners are born of the travail of the church. I know many people sort of take that slant and say, not to credit salvation to the church, but when we as churches do what we ought and we preach the gospel and we labor in prayer, then because of those efforts, God rewards them in part by allowing us to see souls saved. I've heard that growing up all my life. Now here's where I think it becomes clear. Because up to this point, although I think it's a close parallel because we're associated with Christ, you kind of could go either way. But here's where I think people who lean towards the child being Christians in general, or Martin in specific, here's the step that I think that they miss. I think it brings it into focus for me, and that is that the child is the firstborn among other offspring. I've read some commentaries that seem to equate the child with the other offspring and say that the child became other offspring, but the text doesn't say that. It says there was a child, and then there were other offspring. Look at verse 17 in specific. Right? The dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on who? Yeah. The remnant, the rest, the others. It seems to me there's a clear delineation between the child and these others. I think that's linguistically there in the text. And of course we know that Paul in Romans 8 and verse 29 said, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. It's one of many places. I never heard this growing up, but one of the things that I have in my adult Christian life really loved is the picture of Jesus as our elder brother. We are brought into the fold, right? He's the firstborn, the chief son among many children. So with that delineation, I think if we look at all the clues that are in the text, this is clearly speaking of Christ. Right? Matches every one of these, and I think the delineation between the child and the other offspring, I think that's what clarifies us to say this is speaking of Christ. We can draw many parallels, but that's because we're united to Christ. Does that make sense? All right. Now the woman. If you have heard other ones, please feel free to add, but here are the pictures that I have heard people reference. That of Eve, that of Israel, that of Mary, and that of the church. Of course, if we start by identifying the child as Jesus, it would seem to narrow that down. I'm going to say there's a stronger parallel in this. And we need to hold this symbolism loosely. But we'll see how much of that you see with me. All right. Let's jump into the clues in the text about who is this woman. So she's clothed with the sun. She has the moon under her feet. And she is crowned by 12 stars. Before I mention a couple biblical references, may I say, do you remember a while back, I don't remember which session, but I said this is vivid imagery, right? This book, it's vivid imagery. And so sometimes we don't need to lose sight that it's a text and deal with the language that's there, but sometimes we also sort of need to just back up and look at the picture it's painting in our minds. And here's one of those moments. Sun, moon, and stars. So step outside of Revelation 12 right now. If I just said sun, moon, and stars, what's the connection?
Sounds like a Trinity.
Kind of does. What is similar about the sun, moon, and stars?
Light.
Light, right? Even if we go back to the creation narrative, we talk about the greater lights to rule the day and night, and then the stars were created separately. Now, in our modern advanced 21st century, we can say, ah, ha, ha, ha. The moon is not a source of light. It's merely a reflector. Right? Scientifically true. Accurate. But in appearance, and in most of human literature throughout human history, we see the sun, we see the moon. Those are the greater lights, which sort of, again, matches our creation narrative. Funny if you just let the Bible work together. It works really well. And then we see the stars as other points of light. Brilliance, reflecting and magnifying and showing forth, stepping back in to our biblical paradigm, the brilliance and the righteousness and the glories of God. This is a woman who is clothed with the sun. Now that makes no sense, right? What substance, much less creature, could be enveloped by the sun and maintain structure? None, because it burns too hotly. Unless you read comic books, and then there's certain mysterious metals that they find. But that's something else, right? So don't take that too literalistically, that she's clothed with the sun. But rather see that she is shining brilliantly. Sun, moon, and stars all drawn together. The apex and the point of God's creation, bringing Him glory through His human creation. All right, that said, and I think that's valid and that should be seen. And if we miss the sort of looking at the picture, we miss some of the brilliance of this book. But that said, now let's think about specific biblical references. I remember it brought to my mind Genesis chapter 37. There was a certain boy, and he had dreams. And he said, and I dreamed another dream in verse 9. And he told it to his brothers, which some of us would say was probably seemingly a mistake. Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. You remember this account? Joseph, right? Sun, moon, and he says 11 stars. Why? Because he would be the 12th star. Those 12 being the tribes. He was saying that God was going to exalt him. And of course, his family didn't like that very much at all, his brothers specifically. But that's the picture here. This woman is exalted. Again, sun, moon, and stars. 12 stars, 12 tribes, 12, many would say, apostles. Some would say apostles, not tribes, right? Again, we need to see some parallel going on here. All right. It's interesting and it's of importance to note that the term for her crown is the term for the sort of wreath crowns, if you will. Those who denoted victory. If you think back when you learn about like the early Olympic Games, right? They didn't have gold and silver and bronze. They would get laurel leaves or whatever kind of leaves they were, right? That's the kind of crown she's wearing. So she's clothed with the brilliance of God. And she's wearing a crown of victory. And she's in labor. I would say, again, crowned in the brilliance of God's creation, but we'll not tarry there. So listen to these verses, and let's put this together. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, if you want to write that reference down. This is called the Proto-Evangelion, or the Proto-Gospel. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Who's that talking about? Yeah. Jesus is the seed. Who's the woman in this instance? Specifically. Who is being spoken to in Genesis 3? Eve. Yeah. Isaiah 9, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Again, prophesying the birth of Jesus. But who's the us? When Isaiah says, unto us a child is born, who's the us? Specifically Israel, right? Not so much the Egyptians. Not so much the Philistines. Or the other ites and steens and folks. All right. Specifically Israel. Now Luke chapter 2, verse 7. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now that's the actual birth of Christ. So who's the woman there? Mary. The deacon gets it wrong. No. All right. So here's why I say we need to see a stronger parallel. Now, I've already identified for you, I believe the child in this vision is talking about Jesus. And so naturally the woman would be Mary. But Mary is, if you will, Eve. Mary is Israel. In the sense that Eve received the promise and said, through childbearing there will be a seed born, and he will be the one to crush the serpent, right? So Mary is, in a sense, a fulfillment of Eve, right? I'm not saying she was reborn as Mary or anything that straight. I'm just saying thematically. In a sense, right, the promise was made to Abraham, and Abraham became tribes, and those tribes became an official nation that we know as Israel. And it was through Israel, through that lineage, that the seed, the child, the Messiah came. In a sense, thematically, because we're talking about visions here, so don't think I'm saying that Eve was reborn as millions of people and then reborn as Mary. No. But thematically, Mary is Eve, if you'll take my meaning. Eve is, or Mary is Israel. Right? That all led up to the birth of Christ. So in a sense, we could say we see that strong parallelism at least. But I do see that this woman is primarily Mary. So she gave birth to the child. Here's where it gets messy. The woman gets pursued and persecuted. Now, it's true that Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt, right? We don't really have a full account of what may have taken place with Mary in her society after the birth of Christ and through his life. There are sources you could read, but none of them biblically authoritative. That's part of the reason why I say we need to hold the identity of the woman a bit looser and see the parallelism. Because Israel was certainly persecuted. Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt. But what is the ongoing persecution? It's of the church, or the churches. We see the woman as being persecuted. We see the woman as being prepared for and protected for periods of time. 1,260 days, time and half times, right? So, child Jesus, the woman, Mary, as Eve, as Israel, as the church, right? Just kind of, it's like when you ask a woman her age and she says something but she moves her hand over her mouth, right? No, in sincerity, we're dealing with visions and symbolism, so hold that one a bit loosely. And it's okay if the child is a bit loose as well, but I don't think you can make anything outside of primarily Christ work for you. While we're lingering there, while we're talking about that number, 1,260 days, we've seen that before. We've talked about that time period before. Anybody remember what we might have said about it? I mean, Daniel mentions it. We've already encountered it in the Revelation. It was. A time of persecution that is cut short, a time that is allotted. And so, essentially, that times and half the time, or 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 months? Am I right? I said that number wrong, I think, the last time. I'm saying that's symbolic of this time period that we're talking about between the first and second coming of Christ. So when we see that the woman was protected for 1,260 days, or for that time that I'm saying at least, is symbolic of the time between first and second coming of Christ, then we know that Mary didn't literally live for all this time. That's why I say, again, we have to kind of hold this one loosely. Hold it together, but hold it loosely. So is it Mary? Yes. Does it seem like it kind of shifts and starts to be the church? Yes. Does that make sense at all? It's that one's kind of hard. Hold it, but hold it loosely. All right. The dragon. Who knows where this came from, this image?
Devil, maybe.
Yeah, the deviled ham. I don't know why. I got a kick out of seeing that guy every time my mom took me to the grocery store and when I was a kid. And for some reason or another, they had an ad campaign that produced this button, be a devil's advocate. So I stand before you tonight. I know many of you have accused me of being the devil's advocate many times before. Not as an advocate for the actual devil, but as an advocate that the dragon is the devil. Okay? Thank you for some of you laughing at my humor or attempt at it. All right. Who's this dragon? I don't know anybody who says anything but the devil. So I didn't even bother giving you. If you've heard of some, then feel free to share that. He's that ancient serpent. Right? We talked a little bit about his arc last week. How that he was working subversively against God and his causes way back. He's the one who accuses the brethren. Oh, by the way, I should point out when it says that in verse, is that 9? Yes. The great dragon is thrown down, that ancient serpent who's called the devil and Satan. You're wondering, why is that so repetitious? Literally in the original text, it's diabolos, which is the Greek word for the devil, which translated the Old Testament word for Satan. And then they just sort of transliterated in Greek letters the sound of the word Satan, just to make it clear. Isn't it nice in a book steeped with symbolism to have something nailed down? No question, this is who it is. Here we have it. All right. That ancient serpent, who is Satan, who is the devil. All right. He accuses the brethren. If you were here last week, we went through the references in Job chapters 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3. We see Satan there presented as the prosecuting attorney, if you will. Originally, I said that was his intended purpose, and he took it too far and took it for evil means. But he is known as the accuser of the brethren from the beginning. All right. He has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. That's a lot. Of course, we know 7 should stick out to us, and it means complete, right? Fullness. The word that is translated crown here is quite different from the crown that the woman wore. This is a diadem. This is a royal, authoritative crown. This is what a king or a prince would have worn. Not given because of victory, given because of dominion and authority. This picture is very much in harmony with Old Testament Jewish thought and pictures. For instance, Psalm 74. You divided the sea by your might. This is 74:13. Psalm 74:13. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters, or the Leviathan, right? So this picture of a dragon, very common in the Old Testament literature and in contemporary literature of the time, to show wicked kingdoms. So here we have a 7-headed, 7-crowned, 10-horned. What's the picture? A wicked force who is mighty, 10 horns, and who, by the way, has been granted seemingly complete authority. Now, some of you say, no, he hasn't. Well, in context, because does not the Scriptures refer to him as the God of this world? Right? Again, in the last vision sequence, he comes down to open the abyss, and he uses the key that he got from the Lord. So he has been granted great power. That's the reason for this picture. This also matches up, by the way, with the 4th beast in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It differed from the other beast. It had 10 horns. So we're seeing, again, we're borrowing some of those pictures from that Old Testament. All right, so here's the picture of this wicked, evil, authoritative figure. Now, he swept 1/3 of the stars. What does that mean? I have most commonly heard this to say that that's the portion of the angels that he took to his rebellion. Okay. In fact, I've heard some people dogmatically say that's what it has to mean, and I wonder why they're so definitive about that when we don't know what the original number that the third of is. So a third of, I don't know, a lot. I tend to think and agree that we could say angel, but I think it's a more clear picture when we think about who were the stars in the opening vision previously already in this book. I agree with W.T. Russell. He said that it was preachers. In fact, he said, and I quote, "Still being consistent in my teaching," I had to include that introduction. Thank you, Brother Russell, for trying to be consistent. I wish more people were. "Still being consistent in my teaching, these stars were preachers. They were deluded, deceived, and were brought into the fold of paganism or no fold at all. The dragon succeeded in getting a third." Now here's what's curious. Brother Russell said, "I'm glad that's all he took, because that leaves the majority on the Lord's side." Now, I never spoke to him about this. I'm just going off of the lessons that he taught. I would have really wanted to ask him more about that statement, but there you have it. I believe it is talking about the influence that he had. You want to say angels? He clearly has angels. In fact, this says in verse, 5? The dragon and his angels fought back. He clearly has angels on his side. They also fell. The Bible elsewhere talks about those who left their first institution, or their first place. But I believe probably it's more talking about the fact that Satan has not only won heavenly creatures, but also influenced ministers of the gospel. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they never were truly saved and yet they're in position? Could be. Does it also mean that somehow, through his influences, through his wiles, he has deceived truly sainted persons to be pawns in his game? Yeah. Frightening as that may be, absolutely. Yes, you should be very careful of preachers, especially these preachers who have these wild ideas that you've never heard before. Right. Now, I mean, that is true. All right. I want to call a little bit of attention to that third part. So for all those folks who say it must be a third of the angels, and so God has 66.666% of the angels that he originally created, however many that is. Where have we seen that fraction, that number before? This is a book jam-packed with meaningful numbers. Where have we seen 1/3 before? Chapter 8. The second trumpet blast. The figure of 1/3 is an Old Testament reference to judgment. We can see that in places such as Ezekiel 5. For sake of time, I'm not turning there now. And it's also a denial of the totality. Right? Think about that. One of the recurring themes in this book is that we can and we should have trust in the Lord, who is sovereign over the affairs of mankind. Right? So, God destroyed the whole world in the book of Genesis. We can find very similar, almost exact that phrasing. And yet, how many souls were saved in the ark? 8. Right? So many times when we read about the judgment of God, we must understand it's always restrained, else there would be no remnant. So now that God is pouring out his judgments through the agents, if you will, of Satan himself and his demons, and though he has given him great authority, yet who's still in control? That's right. So whether you want to be thankful that the majority are still on the Lord's side with Brother Russell, however you want to look at that, do you know why it's only 1/3? And I'm not saying if we were to quantify how many preachers there have ever been, no, it's symbolic. But why is it just a portion? Is it because the devil and his minions are not powerful enough to overcome humans? No, it's because God is sovereign, period. Right? Yes, he gave the devil the keys to open up the pit. And yes, there is great destruction and great deceit going on. There's terrible things going on. And God allows. He's not the source of the evil, but He absolutely allows it. How long and how far does He allow it? Quite honestly, to the point of His choosing. How long did Noah have to prepare the ark? Until God chose. Yeah, it turned out being 120 years. Enough time to build a boat. How long did any of those pagan nations who overcame Israel and Judah in the Old Testament, how long did they have before they got theirs? Till the time God said, it's enough. There's no part of this that is not under complete control of God. So this picture of this wildly powerful being, and He is, right? 7 heads, 7 crowns. But He only takes a third of the stars. So again, we see God's sovereignty defended. All right. I took a long time. All right. He sought to devour the child. This dragon did. 2 references I want to point you to. Matthew, in the 2nd chapter, that's where we find the interaction with the wise men, the Magi. And when Herod was so furious that the wise men did not come to him, what did he do? He ordered that all male children 2 years and under be executed. Sought to devour the child. John chapter 13, verse 27, the first Lord's Supper, the institution there, that same night, they were gathered together, and it says, John 13, 27, then after He had taken the morsel, Satan entered into Judas. And then Jesus said, what you're going to do, do it quickly. Right? That's just obvious. What does it mean that He was sought to devour the child? Even if you say it's Christians in the church rather than it's Jesus, still, yeah, that's what He's doing. That's what He wants. But, the next clue, He was defeated.
You have to go back to Pharaoh trying to kill Moses also.
Oh yeah. So many times. And these things were allowed. And during these times, either during the time of Pharaoh, during the time of Herod, or whatever event you want to point to, many people died. Many people suffered. But it wasn't successful. 7 heads, 7 crowns, but only a third, right? We keep going back to that. He sought to devour the child, but he was defeated, which was prophesied back in Genesis chapter 3, right? Again, what will happen to the seed of the woman? He will crush the head of the serpent. It says here, I'll try to speed this up so we get to the end of this. He was defeated by the blood of the Lamb and by the witness, right? And they have conquered him, verse 11, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives even unto death. Who's the they? That's the brethren. That's the others. Right? So if the child is Jesus, then who are the other seed? That is believers. That is the faithful. Those are the faithful, however you want to say that. Those are the church members. Those are the martyrs. Those are the ones who endure persecution in this life and hold fast. And we overcome the devil by the testimony when we witness for Jesus. Again, what's the key to overthrowing the devil? The gospel. Being faithful to it, witnessing to it. All right, he was cast out. We dealt with that last time, so I won't go into depth here. His time is short. Why is his time short? It says he's come down with a great wrath. He's very upset. Yeah, because there's no question. Now, truly, there never was. But after Jesus' crucifixion and subsequent resurrection, it's done. These are the last days. He knows it, and that's why he's so angry. Right? He's the devil. And so he continues on to pursue the woman and her offspring. And that last statement, stood on the sand of the sea. I'll say more about that next week because it's kind of the transition into chapters 13 and 14. But I will say, do you remember what I said the sea represented, especially for the Jewish people back then? It was chaos. It was danger. And here we see this great dragon standing right at where that begins. That's fitting. Right? All right. So we've identified the characters. The child's Jesus. The woman is Eve, Israel, Mary in the church. Just say it real fast. It flows. All right. And the dragon is Satan. So how do we put all that together? All right. Before you copy down this, look at your Bibles. Remember I said one of the big mistakes that people make is trying to make everything by chapter and verse order chronological? Remember I said we deal with that duality tonight? All right. The first 6 verses. The picture where there's a pregnant woman and a dragon there to devour the child. That was going on here on earth. Again, with Pharaoh, with Herod, with Judas, right? That's the earthly, that's the horizontal. Then in verse 7, it opens up. Now war arose in heaven. Now we get a picture of the same things from a heavenly standpoint. This should seem very familiar if you were here last week when we talked about the disciples coming back to Christ. Jesus won't believe what's happening. And then Jesus saying, it's even more significant than you know. So here we see 2 parallel pictures. So go ahead and write that down. So the first 6 verses, the woman and the dragon, are parallel with the war and the casting. And then that's picked up in verse 13. Even though Brother Russell and I have some disagreements in this chapter, he essentially says the same thing, that the context of verse 6 is picked up in verse 13. Why? Because it's a parallel. So if you read from verse 6 straight into 13, it reads this way. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given... See, it flows. So don't try to make them compete, and don't try to make part 1, part 2, part 3. You have these 2 parallel accounts. It's the horizontal and it's the vertical. It's the duality. It's the same way, again, we read back in the book of Acts, Saul, who was persecuting churches, and Jesus said, why are you persecuting me? Right? Jesus identifies with his church. There's what's going on here. There's what's going on from a heavenly view. This is how we put this chapter together, and it reads perfectly in harmony. So chapter 12 opens up this 4th sequence with broad strokes. We see the continuity stretch all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. We understand why the devil is so wrathful and why he is so very much after the churches of Christ and after the followers of Christ. Because he knows his time is short, because this has already happened. Because there's been a change. Because he had more reign before. How many of you have ever had or seen those retractable dog collars, right? When they get out too far, can you yank it back and take up the slack? Well, he used to have a lot of slack. He doesn't anymore, and he knows it's about to be the end. This paints that foundational picture. In the same way, if you think back to the sequence of the 7 scrolls, we opened up with that throne room scene, and everything flowed out of that. So chapters 13 and 14 now, we're going to see what and how the devil's going to do in this ongoing persecution that's already mentioned here at the end of the chapter. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask you if you have comments or questions. Yes?
I've dealt in absolutes most of my life.
Oh, that's terrible.
And I don't know that this so I don't know if this makes any difference in anything at all. But is there a path that leads to the belief that the stars are creatures, maybe rather than a church or churches?
Say that again. I think I'm going to answer you correctly, but I want to make sure.
Is there a path that leads to the thought that the stars are creatures, maybe rather than churches?
Yes.
Or something else?
So
I mean, that's not just, obviously, that can be just arbitrarily picked.
no, but if we go back to chapter 1, and verse, here it is, right here, verse right at the end of the first chapter. All right, we're back up to 17 just for context. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So Christ is speaking here to John. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are and those that are to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. And so it's how you understand that phrase, the angels of the 7 churches. And usually that's taken to be the pastors, or maybe even more broadly, the preachers of the churches. I kind of, when we went through this, said it's both, because there's things going on heavenly that match up. But yeah, that's what Brother Russell connected back to. That's what I connected, and I think most who would take that view. Now, where it got to be the third of the angels, I think is just a lack of consistency in the way the terms are used. Right? Because angels are some, seeing a connection to angels and stars, that kind of makes sense. And if this is Satan's rebellion, and we know he had some angels, I think that just sort of come together without matching up a continuity between the texts. Does that make sense? Good question.
Is this going to be like a fast thing or a gradual bending or falling in these preachers? The reason I ask this question is because being in my line of work, I get to go to different places, and I do go to different places, and some of the places I go to visit is like plumb bizarre, and I'm thinking, where did they get this? This is nowhere close to the gospel. And
So, what we can gather just from what we see around us, from reading church history, etc., things don't happen overnight, right? There's the seed of doubt or the seed of misunderstanding, whatever that's planted, and it grows over time. Now, the picture here is given of a violent and sudden casting down. And again, I'll refer to Brother Russell. If you haven't listened to or read through, it's clear he and I disagree on some points, but I recommend you reading it. He did some good work. And he talked about how everyone had certainly seen, and I don't remember if he says a crocodile or a gator, but he talks about the strength of their tail and how that they knock down prey oftentimes. And so he uses that as an illustration of what's being pictured here, and I think he's right. But as far as how does it actually work out in the lives of individuals, most of the time it's over time. People are worn down. They become frustrated by one thing or another, or confused. And it's like that old saying that those of you in aeronautics maybe, that your attitude, meaning which way an aircraft is pointing up or down, affects your altitude, right? Just a couple degrees up will make you go higher or down, make you go lower. And so the same is true with our doctrine. If we're off by a degree, right now we're not far off, but down the road we'll be far off, right? Does that make sense?
yeah, it kind of does, because if you know the basics of the gospel, and then you come along and listen to these people who are bizarre, they got a wild kind of a message. But if you don't know any better,
Sure.
and it's fairly easy. The more ignorant a person is, meaning the lack of knowledge, the more easily they can be deceived.
True. Very true. and as far as how we wind up places and how different church movements or religious movements have gotten to where they are, it's not always one of those immediately fruitful disciplines, but trying to look at historical theology or tracing doctrines and positions can be very informative. How did we get to where we are today? We could either wrongly say we're exactly the same as we've always been, and that's wrong. Or we can say, you know what, we've slipped in this direction for a time, and then such and such happened, and we slipped in this direction. And that's true. If we go back on different issues, to read church history is to watch the ebbs and the flows. I think it was Martin Luther who, even in his day, so 16th century, said that he, looking at church history, of course it would have been different, but he said it was like watching a drunk on a horse. You fall off one side, they climb up, and they fall off the other side, right? So tracing those courses back, helping us understand where we got, very helpful, very interesting, and it rarely ever happens in a day. And I have spent way too long answering your question. All right, anything else?
When you look back at church history and see how many churches came out of what was the true
Yes.
church over time where they are now, and it shows it's a slow process.
Very true. Very true.
It's kind of like the saying, as a twig is bent, so grows a tree.
Yes. Anything else? If not, thank you for your attention. I'll stop the recordings, and when we come back, we'll be looking at chapters 13 and 14.